The political right have had a good few decades. They've defeated the trade unions, cut taxes, deregulated the financial markets, and now pushed Britain out of the European Union. But all this winning has presented its own problems. England's right-wingers have nothing serious left to complain about. That's my somewhat depressing analysis or hypothesis of why Britain's leading right-wingers are throwing their toys out of the pram when it comes to the government's announcement that masks will become compulsory to wear in shops. But do Dalia, Gebrial and James Meadway agree? They are my two guests tonight. Dalia, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Very well. Just depressed that, the right have done so much winning. They get to complain about masks and be taken seriously. But I don't know. I hope we're going to push back against that hypothesis tonight because it is a depressing one. James, you are speaking to us from Bulgaria.
I am. It's quite nice here. It's warm. It's late.
You look like you might have caught the sun, actually.
I think I have, and I think it's also they're just ending quarantine, so that's nice as well. So.
So tell us the situation. Everyone wants to know what flying is like these days.
Oh, okay. Like odd, as you might anticipate. People are pretty good about wearing their masks, and I suspect people will be pretty good about wearing their masks. If you look at the rest of the crisis, every time the government said you should do something and been clear about it, people have got the idea and wanted to do something because not everyone's wildly antisocial and throwing their toys out the pram about having to wear a mask or something. So people are pretty good about that. If you get off, there's various things that the Bulgarian authorities do to make you register where you're staying and checking up on you and that sort of thing. But that is ending as of midnight tonight. So there we are.
Oh, and then you're free.
I think so, yes. And I think everybody arriving will be, although cases predictably are picking up. And also there's a huge political crisis here, which is fun, obviously.
All right. Tonight we're going to talk about this mask freak out. What's behind it? How far will it go? Will we see a culture war about masks in the UK to the same extent we have in the United States? And we'll also talk about Rishi Sunak potentially outflanking Labour to the left on tax, the decision to ban Huawei from operating in Britain, and then finally the Andrew Neil show getting cancelled. It turns out it wasn't Owen Jones that ended Andrew Neil's, frontline BBC career. It's not necessarily quite over, but it was budget cuts, which finally brought an end to his Wednesday evening interview show. More on that later. As ever, please share the link on Twitter, on Facebook. We want to get more people in watching this show live. On Tuesday, it was finally announced that the government would be making face masks mandatory in Britain's shops. For most of the country, this has begged the question as to why this did not happen earlier. In much of Europe, face masks have been mandatory since about March. Apologies. It's obviously a costly proposal. Why it didn't happen earlier completely boggles the mind. But a peculiar subset of the British public, right-wing talking heads, have had a fairly different response, a far more visceral one, in fact. So to these loudmouths, compulsory face covering while shopping is not a perfectly reasonable measure to limit viral spread in a global pandemic, but rather an affront to our hard-earned liberty. Let's take a look at Isabel Oakeshott on Twitter, who I think provided the prime example of the batshit politics behind opposition to wearing masks in shops. Muzzles should be voluntary, not mandatory. Another sinister encroachment of the state. At Michael Gove was right. Keep the law out of it and let people exercise their common sense. The obvious response: muzzles are only if the danger is you're going to bite people. So I don't know. I don't know what the root of calling masks muzzles is. Lots of people on the right doing it at the moment. She followed it up though with something even more bizarre. How long before someone develops a sneeze catcher and we are all required by law to attach it to our noses? The answer to that question is in 10 days, because the whole point of a mask is to catch your sneeze and it goes over your nose. So there's a bit of logic missing there. Toby Young, obviously, obviously that he's come out with a stupid opinion on this. In his blog, Lockdown Skeptics, Toby Young refers to masks as mandatory face nappies. So if you're wondering why Toby Young is wearing Pampers over his facial orifices in the thumbnail for tonight's show, that's why. But regretfully, this pseudo-libertarian mask phobia was not just confined to Twitter. This was Tory MP Desmond Swayne speaking yesterday in the House of Commons.
Nothing would make me less likely to go shopping than the thought of having to mask up. Was this consultation with the police force, and particularly the Chief Constable of Hampshire, for it is she that will have to enforce this monstrous imposition against myself and a number of outraged and reluctant constituents.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the balance in the need to restrict the spread of the virus, whilst also allowing the ancient liberties of a gentleman to go shopping, is a difficult balance to strike. And we have made the judgment that the best way to strike it is to allow a gentleman to go shopping, but require him to wear a face mask. And of course, the enforcement is for the police, but the enforcement is, I think, will largely be undertaken by the British people themselves, who have been remarkable in their fortitude at sticking with these rules, even whilst they may be a frustrating imposition.
It was a stupid question. You might be surprised that someone could rise to a senior position in the Conservative Party whilst believing such nonsense. But it was also surprising for which MP it was that made that intervention. Desmond Swain is, I suppose, a hardliner Conservative MP who is not known for a reluctance to cover his face. You might have heard about him because on a previous show we talked about how Desmond Swain is a defender of blackface. He was pictured wearing blackface to a party and said it was a perfectly reasonable and sensible thing to do. So he's willing to. I suppose maybe if someone found a way to suggest that wearing face masks in shops was racist or racially offensive, he'd find a reason to do it. Maybe that's the sort of psychological game that the government could play if the behavioural scientists were working even harder than they already are. Dalia, what is going on here? What do you make of this? Do you buy my theory that it's because they've just won so much, or is there something deeper going on? Is there a real ideological commitment behind this latest bout of whining from the libertarian right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as sort of James mentioned earlier, I definitely think that sort of this is coming obviously from like this tiny group of babies, essentially. But we also are seeing like very low compliance comparatively with mask wearing in the UK. So, and this is partly down to like poor government messaging. So, it's not the job of everyday people to be sort of researching why masks are important and why this should be a key part of public health. It's the job of the state. It's the job of the government to sort of get that and digest it into like actionable direction. A friend of mine who lives in New York was absolutely shocked that I said that, the vast majority of people in shops, but also like out and about, are not wearing masks here. But I think that this also I actually think there is a kind of ideological thing happening here. And I think what we're seeing is a reflection, and I'm seeing this also in the kind of cancel culture, free speech argument sort of thing that has resuscitated itself as it does every so often when everyone's really bored. It kind of reflects these very narrow and individualized ideas of freedom that have really governed sort of the West in particular since the rise of neoliberalism, since that kind of Thatcherist cultural as well as economic intervention. And it kind of looks at individual behavior as only relevant or only important insofar as individually born consequences. So it doesn't consider how, the perhaps minor concessions or minor behaviors that may be minor to one person could have significant impacts on the collective freedom, and an idea that, we are not just individuals existing in our little silos, but actually our behavior impacts on the collective good. And I think that's one thing that this pandemic has really challenged, which is this idea that you don't just have to think about your own likelihood of getting the virus or the consequences for you if you are exposed to the virus, and making that kind of value judgment on whether or not going to the hairdresser is worth potentially catching the virus, but actually thinking about being a vector and potentially transmitting it. If everyone wore a mask, okay, it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it would make disabled people, it would make elderly people, it would make people with underlying health conditions able to leave their house on the odd occasion, rather than having to sort of shield and be petrified of leaving the house because other people are being really irresponsible. So I think it really taps into this particular idea of individualized, fragmented freedom that has become really popularized under neoliberalism, that is kind of showing its head in a really obvious way with this pandemic, because the laws of the pandemic do not abide by that ideology. But also the consequences of that ideology are not just in how the pandemic is playing out, but that's actually kind of, I think, a culmination or a symbol for how society has been run, particularly in the West, over the past 30 years.
Also, as you said earlier, as if Desmond Swayne does his own shopping.
I mean, it's actually hilarious, this idea that when was the last time any of these particularly men like went into a grocery shop? This doesn't affect them at all. They're just used. But I really do think that they genuinely believe that that freedom can be encapsulated by whether or not you should wear a mask to stop other people from dying. So I actually think that it's not just a kind of time-wasting sort of just, frivolous thing. I think it reflects a really deeper sort of cultural and ideological breakdown that we have, which is why I think that Europe and North America in particular have dealt with this pandemic really badly, because the notion of acting in the collective good has been portrayed as a weakness for 30 or 40 years. So it's no wonder that something as simple as wearing a mask so that people who are maybe less physically older than you or more vulnerable than you sort of rubs up against these people's sense of self so significantly. I mean, it's pathetic, but it's also scary.
On the bright side, these people might be in positions of influence, but they are very much a minority when it comes to public opinion. YouGov put out some data today, which I didn't find remotely surprising. I don't know if the Desmond Swaynes of this world did too. So their conclusion, YouGov data shows that the public may simply be waiting for the government to tell them they have to wear a mask. So people were asked, would you support or oppose making it compulsory to wear face masks in the following places whilst the outbreak is still ongoing? 91% of the general population support it being mandatory on public transport. 80% support it being mandatory in shops. And 68% of the population support it being mandatory in busy outdoor areas like town centres and high streets. I think only 16% of the population agree with Desmond Swayne that having mandatory face mask wearing in shops is an affront to our liberty. James, you're a policy guy. I suppose sort of two questions is one, you worked in Parliament for a while. Did you ever meet these types of people? And two, from a policy perspective, why did it take quite so long, in your view, for the government to come round to a cost-free, obvious position, which is to say, the way you solve a collective action problem whereby people have to do something, but they all have to do it at the same time, is just to say it's mandatory. What took so long?
There's a couple of things. Well, yes, occasionally you do bump into these people, but particularly at the minute, particularly if they're not wearing masks or whatever, you probably want to keep out of their way. Why did it take so long? I think Dalia is basically right. There's an underlying ideological thing about this is an imposition. We're going to jump up and down about it. Right at the start of the crisis, the far right in Europe, at least, had a bit of a dilemma about this one, which was that the government was suddenly going to start doing a load of things that they look quite authoritarian. We're going to close borders, and therefore we can racialize the closing of borders. This is Matteo Salvini's in Italy. His immediate reaction was that we have to be really, really clear. We don't like Chinese people. That's why we're going to close the border. And as the crisis worn on, in fact, probably quite quickly, they flipped in the other direction and went, "This is a terrible imposition. How dare the government demand that we wear face masks or don't do a whole list of things that are obviously fairly stupid to do in a pandemic." So they flipped the other way around, and clearly it's now, as things have gone on, it's definitely come out in that direction rather than a more sort of authoritarian version of it. But what's really striking, a bit I think that messes their heads up, is that people over comply with this. Like, the lockdown was already happening before the government said the lockdown should happen. This was already people starting to make this thing happen. It's like a lockdown from below. Why is it that, despite the declaration of Super Saturday 2 weeks ago or a weekend ago, like, people didn't just rush back to the pub and hug everybody they met and lick their faces or whatever? It was actually that people were quite restrained about this because they appreciate the broader dangers of it. People do have quite a good collective sense of these things. In terms of what happened with face masks, there's a really peculiar thing that's happened, with if you take a sort of international comparison of who's had I wouldn't say a good crisis, but who's had a bad crisis and who's had a worse crisis. The places that have managed it quite well. It's got nothing to do with what you might anticipate. The richer you are, broadly speaking, the better you are at dealing with health issues. You might have thought it hasn't played out like that at all. It's a complete spread. So Vietnam, Kerala in India, both done well. New Zealand, quite a rich country, has done well. Japan's actually done pretty well about this. The response has been the techniques that have been applied and how they've responded to it. Whereas some very rich countries, the US, a catastrophe. Here, another catastrophe. It's a rich country. So it's got nothing to do with how it plays out. And it comes down to the kind of responses put in place. Do you do a number of basically fairly cheap, simple things like get everyone wearing masks and stop people all meeting together in big groups and this sort of thing? Or do you do what's kind of happened in Britain and has happened in America? You say, we'll get some tech to sort it out. We'll rush for getting a vaccine. We'll get contact tracing apps. We'll do all these sort of things, none of which has really worked out. So it's peculiar how it's played out like that, and it's probably going to have quite a long-term sort of impact. Economically, you can see that countries that responded better are now in a much better position economically than places responded badly, like Britain, which is absolutely hammered by this.
Dalia, you want to come in briefly on this one?
Yeah, and just picking up from that, I also think it's a really interesting way in which the right have really won this argument on what freedom and security means, or not security, but let's say freedom and independence. And that is that there's the sense of wearing masks or being socially obliged to wear masks is an impingement of freedom, but giving all of our data over to a track and trace app, which wouldn't be that necessary if there was actually adequate compliance with masks, that's somehow not an infringement on our freedom and a handing over of huge amounts of important data to the state. So I think this kind of like the way that they've won this culture war on what it means to have freedom of speech or freedom of association, and also sort of liberty, those ideas of civic liberties, is something that we should be really worried about as well.
Tiski Sao, you're watching Novara Media. Please share the show link so we get more people in here watching live. As ever, give us a like. It helps us on the algorithm. And if you do enjoy our work, if you want to help Novara Media expand, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do, we cannot say thank you enough. As we discussed on Monday's show, Labour are avoiding any commitment on whether or not Britain should have a wealth tax. The excuse they've given for fence sitting is that there is no need to decide on any policies until 2024. However, if a briefing to the Times last night has any truth to it, they may not have the luxury of waiting quite so long when it comes to taxes on the rich. Let's take a look at the front page of this morning's Times. Threat of homes tax to pay for pandemic. Yes, Annalise Dodds might have ruled out a wealth tax to get us out of this crisis, just as the Conservative Chancellor is considering them. Sunak has asked the Office for Tax Simplification to assess whether capital gains taxes should be increased to help pay for the coronavirus recovery. And we can get up some copy from that article, from that front page. In ordering the review of capital gain tax, which taxes profits on homes and other assets, Sunak wants advisors to consider how gains are taxed compared with other types of income. Experts said that Mr. Sunak may be considering raising its historically low rates to the same levels as income tax, which could bring in £90 billion over 5 years. James, I'm going to go to you because this policy might sound somewhat familiar to you. I think when you were in the Shadow Treasury team, Labour were floating the idea of bringing taxes from wealth in line with taxes from income. Is that true? Was that Labour policy, and is this something we should celebrate that now Sunak's considering it?
Yeah, it's in the 2019 manifesto, I think. And the figure, the £90 billion figure, is from an Institute for Public Policy Research paper from last year. What they're specifically talking about is you have income tax, which basically if you earn over £12,000 you pay. And then you have capital gains tax, which is if you sell some assets. Now, they say homes. Actually, if you're selling your first home, the home that you live in, you don't ever pay this. If you're selling a second home, you might have to pay it. If you're selling some art that you have or shares, you might have to pay it, right? So it's a tax on the gains you make from doing this sort of thing, which means a very small section of people ever pay the thing. If you increased capital gains tax, it overwhelmingly hits the wealthy. But the really peculiar thing at the minute is that you could be facing income tax at 40% if you're a higher rate earner, but you'd only have capital gains tax at like 20% or possibly even 10% with some of the exemptions. So there's a massive distortion in the system where people are actually earning money from work. That's like mostly if you're getting income tax, that's what you're doing, are being taxed more heavily than people who are getting like gains from trading shares or whatever it might be over here. All right, which is, it's sort of, I think in a lot of people's heads, quite rightly, this seems completely unfair. There's no real reason to tax these two things differently. It's just a bit of a handout for the rich. So the policy is a good one. The idea you equalise these two things is a good one. The fact you can bring in perhaps £90 billion is a good thing. The Tories have been knocking around these ideas for a while, since at least the start of the year. They've had, I think, a former advisor to David Cameron writing for the Social Market Foundation, sort of centre-right think tank, on the need to bring in wealth taxes. They've gone round and round this. There was a scare about it ahead of what became Rishi Sunak's first sort of budget this year, where the Telegraph and the Times again were jumping up and down about it. So it's gone round and round. They're clearly poking away at this. If you read Guido Fawkes, I don't always recommend this, but the Tories had sent out an opinion poll to their membership, asking what kind of tax rises would you like. I mean, I can kind of guess what the answers might be in this, but they're obviously pushing away at this issue, and it looks like they're trying to line up an argument for the autumn budget, probably due in September, October this year, around potentially some of these tax rises. But it's an inherently good policy. It's a sort of thing that the left ought to be talking about.
And do you think the Labour Party are about to get outflanked? Or do you, I mean, you're often known, you're a bit like me when you tweet, people say you're looking for a job with Keir Starmer quite often. But do you think they've erred here in sort of sitting on the fence when it comes to wealth taxes?
The problem they've got is that there are going to be costs of adjustment to this sort of, I don't think we're ever going to have a post-COVID world, really. We're just sort of stuck with this one way or the other from now on. So there's costs of adjustment to that. And the cost of that adjustment will be borne by one group of people or another. It's either tens of thousands of people losing their jobs, or it's a few rich people contributing a bit more. And either we line that argument up now as Labour and as the left, and you say this is where it's going to land, or you just let somebody else define it, and maybe they'll have a wealth tax, or maybe they'll do something else, or whatever. You don't necessarily have to get into the level of policy detail, although there are on-the-table policies sitting there which are basically sensible. But you have to at least indicate a line of travel in this and say what you want to do about it. I mean, Keir Starmer did have a good video out for the Durham Miners Gala over the weekend, cancelled or postponed, just saying Labour will make sure workers never pay for the crisis. It's a very good line. But then you have to answer the question, so who will pay for the crisis? Because if you don't, somebody else will answer that for you. And the answer may be very unpleasant in lots and lots of different ways.
We're going to go to some details from the Office for Budget Responsibility. So these briefings about potential tax increases came on the same day that the OBR delivered sobering projections about the economic impact of coronavirus. So the OBR is tasked by the Treasury to provide independent economic forecasts and model debt levels. They poured cold water on any hopes for a quick recovery after a COVID lockdown. Let's get this chart up. So this is their projection, and you can see here that in the central scenario, whilst they say that we come out of the depth of the recession fairly quickly, it is not until late 2022 that the economy will be running back at 2019 levels. And on the downside scenario, it's not until 2024. And they also suggested that 15% of furloughed workers were likely to become unemployed once the job retention scheme ends, and suggested that around £60 billion of spending cuts or tax increases would be needed to get government debt down to around 75% of GDP. I'm going to go straight back to you, actually, James, because this is a very wonky one. So I suppose two parts of the questions, which is one, how seriously should we take these forecasts? And two, if I'm correct, the OBR was sort of created by George Osborne as a way of cementing, I suppose, fiscal orthodoxy when it came to not having large deficits. And now the fact that they're saying we should have cuts of £60 billion or tax increases of £60 billion to get debt to GDP down to 75%. Should we just be ignoring this as ideologically motivated, or is this something that we should be taking seriously?
There's two bits. I mean, one is like forecasting at a time like this is even by the usual standards of economic forecasting is going to look it's going to be dubious to. You can get an indicator of where you might be going from some of the numbers and from trying to get the models to work like this. But to be honest with you, it's like there's so much uncertainty attached to what's happening. I mean, I would say that the OBR forecast is almost certainly too optimistic. I mean, the chances are we will hit a second wave. The chances are this will involve a lockdown or a partial lockdown. The impact on economic growth at that point is going to be significant. There are long-term impacts of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, which is reductions in productivity, all kinds of extra costs for biosecurity measures, potentially long-term health impacts, which are only just becoming apparent, the risk of never having a vaccine that works for it. You stack these things up. So all of this looks optimistic on their part. First one. The second bit is, you're right about why the OBR was created. The thing was created to try and push a sort of, effectively to try and push a particular argument about why austerity was the critical thing to do, and to give the OBR a very, very particular focus on the debt and the deficit, and therefore always insist that this was going to be, austerity was necessary to get rid of the debt and get rid of the deficit. In fairness, under Robert Choate, the guy who's running it previously, I think it sort of adjusted against that and became a bit more obviously independent of government. It was much more serious about what was happening to the economy in the last 10 years than ever the Tory governments were at any point in time. It was quite sober and realistic about some of this stuff. What you see happening now, I think, is it's having to run down the train tracks that were set for it. It's just got a new head who's just been appointed. This guy who used to work at the IMF, who was overseeing or helping oversee some of the programs that were implemented in Europe in the last sort of decade or so. So it's running down these train tracks and it's coming out with these kind of projections. The critical bit right now is that we absolutely do not need tax rises to pay for this. Interest rates for government are the lowest just about in human history. In fact, they turned negative just a few weeks ago. So in other words, people are paying the government to borrow money. There's no reason at all to say that the immediate costs of coronavirus, COVID-19, should be dealt with by whacking up taxes for anybody. It's just pointless. Somewhere down the line, we are going to have to make, and somewhere down the line, by the way, in the next few months, we are going to have starting to make serious, real economic adjustments to a world in which there is pandemic risk and we can't do certain activities. So things like aviation look very different, right? Hospitality looks different. That is a real cost. The costs of doing that will have to land somewhere. They should land on the broadest shoulders. They should land on the people who can actually carry those costs, which is the wealthy in this society. So that's where you need to get to somewhere down the line. Right now, there is no real argument about let's whack up taxes to pay for all this debt that we're building up. It's not it's not a serious economic argument.
And Dalia, I'm going to bring you in because you've been looking at, I think, some of the dumb things the government have been spending money on during the coronavirus crisis. Obviously, from the left, our critique of the government during coronavirus isn't that they spent too much. I mean, many of the spending decisions were correct. The furlough, for example, also many areas where spending decisions were completely lacking. They should have given way more money to people who were sheltering, for example. But they've been contracting out big jobs, expensive jobs to some surprising people. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a really great report by Open Democracy, which has been reported on again by George Monbiot in The Guardian, where he actually revealed that it's not so much about, how, as you mentioned, how much is being invested, and that's where our critique lies. We know that a huge amount of money had to be invested in this in order to get us through this crisis. But we're seeing, again, this model of an economy that is based very much on cronyism. So we've seen, for example, various contracting out of various ways to deal with the pandemic to companies that are not necessarily the ones that are most qualified to actually handle the crisis, but actually are ones that have sort of political or personal connections to members of the government. Most prominently, this has been happening in terms of with the Cabinet Office and the contracts that can be handed out by the Cabinet Office, which is run by Michael Gove. And we've been talking about this. This has been a recurring theme. Not a few weeks ago, we talked about a similar issue with an MP and the housing contracts and regeneration contracts that were being handed out and how they were being enabled to kind of evade regulations on affordable housing by having those close personal connections with MPs. And it's very much that this is the kind of model of the economy that we are seeing. And the problem, as George Monbiot points out, is that when the economy is run in these terms, and similarly also actually with the track and trace app, which was potentially going to be outsourced to the company that ran the Vote Leave campaign, which is, you know, a huge amount of data to hand over to a company that is not publicly accountable to anyone. So this kind of this shows a sort of a model of running the economy that is deeply corrupt and is sort of rotten to its core. And I think piggybacking off what James was saying, you know, what we are seeing in this pandemic is a clear space that is being made to articulate very bold visions going forward. It is not only clear that business as usual is not only wasn't working, but also doesn't need to work in the particular way that it does, but also that many of the things that have happened during the pandemic are, again, intensifications of what has been happening historically. We are seeing appetite. And, you know, Christine Berry talked about this also in a recent op-ed in The Guardian, where she sort of talked about the appetite for not only a new way of doing things, but actually the discrediting of the kind of austerity neoliberal management of the economy that had been bolstered by the Tory, that had sort of bolstered Tory support for the past decade. It was what they, you know, originally got into office for, was through this kind of tightening our belts rhetoric. And I guess my worry is that the Tories are being able to define the boundaries of that shift. So that shift has been won because of anti-austerity activists and campaigners and some MPs within the Labour Party who have articulated the case against austerity. So the argument's been won. And now the Tories are getting to define how far it goes. And so we're seeing these, frankly, you know, not, you know, these capital gains taxes, you know, they're not going far enough. We're seeing Boris Johnson's, you know, appropriation of New Deal language in order to talk about a rescue package that in no way resembles the actual, what is actually implied by a no deal. So by being quiet on this issue and by failing to articulate and push the boundaries of this shift of public opinion, we are allowing the Tories to manage and control that shift in public opinion, which has happened because of anti-austerity activists. So it's almost like we've run the whole marathon and stopped, 5 meters before the finish line. So that's really where my worry lies when it comes to actually what this pandemic means for the economy going forward.
We're going to get up that article quickly because there are some real nuggets of gold in there, or I suppose, shit in terms of government giving out contracts, but in terms of journalism. I think we can get up that article now. So some of the examples of people who've got money when it doesn't seem like they probably should have done. Pest Fix, which is a pest control company. They had assets worth only £18,000, so they're not a particularly big organisation. And they got a £32 million contract to supply surgical gowns. None of them have arrived yet. None of them are being used in the NHS. It sounds like quite a lot of wasted money. But we can go down to actually the paragraph. It's third from last, or second from last, actually, if you can get this off Fox. So we're sort of listing all the different cases. He says, there are plenty of other cases, such as the employment agency with net assets of £623 that was awarded an £18 million government contract to supply face masks. The confectionery wholesaler that, according to the GLP, was given a £100 million contract to supply PPE, and the £250 million channeled through a family office registered in Mauritius, specializing in currency trading, offshore property and private equity, also to supply protective medical equipment. Altogether, billions of pounds worth of contracts appear to have been granted, often to surprising companies without competition. I think we may reasonably ask what the hell is going on. Obviously, it was recently made public that I think £15 billion was spent on PPE by the government. People were wondering how the hell could you spend that much money while still failing to get important equipment to the front line? And it seems like it was by channeling £250 million here and there to currency traders in the Mauritius. So I think there's going to be some real, when it becomes apparent, all of the cronyism that has gone on through this crisis. Hopefully the government won't get away with it. Who knows? We'll be here to help shine light on their catastrophic response to coronavirus to help us expand. Please go to environmedia.com/support. Our next story. First of all, share the show link. We want to get to 2,000 people watching tonight. Next story. This January, Boris Johnson gave the go-ahead for Huawei, the Chinese telecoms giant, to help build and maintain the UK's 5G network. Yesterday, in Parliament, less than 6 months after that decision, the Culture Secretary, Oliver Dowden, announced a dramatic U-turn.
From the end of this year, telecoms operators must not buy any 5G equipment from Huawei. And once the Telecom Security Bill is passed, it will be illegal for them to do so. But I know that honourable members have sought a commitment from the government to remove Huawei equipment from our 5G network altogether. This is why we have concluded that it is necessary and indeed prudent to commit to a timetable for the removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G network by 2027. Let me be clear. This requirement will be set out in law by the Telecom Security Bill. By the time of the next election, we will have implemented in law an irreversible path for the complete removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G networks.
Yep, so that's a very sharp contrast to the announcement made in January. Not only would British firms be banned from buying kits from Huawei from the 31st of December, but any Huawei kit already installed in Britain would, due to security concerns, have to be removed by 2027. It might be very costly for the companies involved. So why the change of heart? Well, one man thinks it's due to his personal persuasive skills.
We convinced many countries, and I did this myself for the most part, not to use Huawei because we think it's an unsafe security risk. It's a big security risk. I talked many countries out of using it. If they want to do business with us, they can't use it. Just today, I believe that UK announced that they're not going to be using it.
But that was Trump saying it was all down to his powers of persuasion. Surprise, surprise. It wasn't soft power, but rather hard power sanctions that ultimately pushed the UK into a U-turn. So Britain's decision 6 months ago to approve the use of Huawei kit in our 5G network was in part due to reassurances that many of the components in the kit provided by Huawei would be US made. And that was supposed to limit the overall control of the Chinese firm over the network. But since then, US sanctions have been imposed, which ban American firms from selling semiconductors to Huawei. And that means the company will need to replace those components with things made by Chinese-based firms. This, according to British intelligence officials, means giving 5G contracts to Huawei poses a much more significant security risk than before these sanctions were imposed. James, I know you've been following this story closely for months. What's the significance of this, and is this the right decision from the Conservative government here?
It's. I mean, the significance is huge. It's probably the biggest thing we've talked about today. In some ways, because it's 5G has this potential. And it will end up shaping a great deal of how we live our lives, simply because it's a massive expansion of the kind of data economy that we've all ended up being a part of for the last 10 years or so. And that means that, you have every single thing you can think of connected to the internet at all times. You have this sort of internet of things. You have massive expansion of bandwidth. That's what 5G dangles in front of us. That's the bits where you want to try and get to. That's the kind of commercial potential of the thing. That's why the telecoms operators in Britain were really pushing the government to say, can we carry on using Huawei equipment? Because as things stand, Huawei produces basically reliable and cheap stuff that you can put as infrastructure as part of your 5G installations and other bits of telecoms infrastructure. I mean, basically, they've been operating in Britain in some fairly fundamental bits of infrastructure since the late 2000s. And that also means that Britain has the British state has a long experience with some of the security risks around this. They've had a Huawei cyber security centre set up in Cambridge since 2010. So there's a reasonably good experience of what the company's up to and using the equipment and this sort of thing. So it's quite a sharp break to suddenly say, we're actually going to ban this in a really, really critical part of what a sort of future path for economic growth and development looks like, which includes 5G in a very, very big way, particularly actually on the back of the pandemic. The expansion of the data economy in the back of the pandemic, I think is one of the overwhelming factors that's coming out of this. So it's a big shift there. And the reason it's happening has got nothing really to do with, in the end, to do with sort of cybersecurity or whether China can read your emails or get into 5G or whatever it might be. Most countries in the world have some capability at least to deliver at least some part of that. We've known this for almost a decade after the Edward Snowden revelations and a few other things that have come out. So that's kind of there. The bit that really matters here, I think, is that this is a deepening of a sort of technological Cold War between the US and China, and sharper lines being drawn on the basis of which technology you're using, and if you're going to use American or American approved equipment, or if you're going to use, China or China approved equipment. So it's a really quite a sharp division that's imposed there. It also says something about the Brexit positioning of this government, in that Europe's it's hardening, but it's much softer on the use of Huawei equipment in 5G telecommunications. Again, you run up against the problem that the two major European suppliers, Ericsson and Nokia, are, at this point in time, not as cheap as and not as readily able to supply the equipment needed as Huawei is. So there's a kind of reticence in Europe about just imposing an outright ban. In other words, this kind of feeds into the government's Brexit positioning. Does it want a big free trade deal with the US, or does it want something close to Europe? At the start of the year, it looked like it was going to go with something fairly close to Europe. This, one way or the other, and I suspect that Britain is not entirely making its own choices here, knocks it much closer to a sort of US free trade deal version of Brexit rather than an EU version of Brexit.
And how should we approach this, this technological Cold War, if that's what it becomes? Because, I mean, obviously the mainstream narrative that we're being fed is this is sort of authoritarian capitalism versus liberal democracy, and we should be aligning with the liberal democratic side. You could also look at it from a sort of development perspective, whereby you've got a country which obviously is rich and powerful now, but it's got much lower GDP per head than in the West. And what they're trying to do is a strategy of sort of bringing over high value technologies to their country, so they don't have to just provide cheap labor. So it could be seen as a way of making a more equal world for them to be building up their own high-tech industries. And that's what it seems the United States is trying to stunt. So is this, a case of the West trying to keep a developing country underdeveloped, or is this an ideological battle between two different forms of capitalism? Sort of how do you think we should look at this conflict, which seems to be emerging?
Well, it's one of those, I wouldn't say either of those things were accurate at this point. It's not greatly useful to talk about China as a sort of developing country by this point. It's the second largest, in some measures, perhaps even the largest or close to being the largest economy on the planet. So if you're talking about development, it's not quite where we are. There are sort of internal long-term Chinese development issues, if you like, of getting out of the so-called middle income trap, of moving a large number of people from being relatively better off than they were into being, having a standard consumption similar to what we have in the US and doing in the West, and doing this on a very wide basis. And that's quite a challenge for them. This is what the various 5-year plans go round and round over the last few years that they've been produced. But putting it in a sort of development frame, I don't think is greatly helpful. Likewise, just going, it's an ideological authoritarian capitalism versus liberal democracies. Well, to be honest with you, by this point, Laurie McFarlane, I think, had a very good piece on Open Democracy about China setting a pattern for the rest of the world's development, that everybody is getting technology which has these tremendous implications, what we take to be liberal democracies. And we're well aware of a lot of these things by this point. We're well aware what's happened to elections over the last few years, what's happened to public discourse. We know how the technology can run away from us and where it can lead us. So the bit is to step back and say, how do we place any of this under some form of public control? And that, I think, gets you into the harder arguments about who owns the technology, who uses it, what are the capacities that are being applied, what is the transparency and the regulation of it, rather more than what's the overarching sort of model. So a lot of this work, I think, is being done in terms of like practically what happens. I think a lot of it is happening on almost a city or regional level. I think if you look at Barcelona or Amsterdam, where there's been attempts by the city council and city authorities to grab some technological sovereignty back, to say, if we're going to have to do deals with large telecoms firms, we want at least some of the value being produced to come back to the people here. That, I think, is part of the model that we have to start looking at. So it's different forms of ownership of technology, different ways of regulating the technology, and broadly speaking, trying to put this in a more democratic, transparent setting than either of the two alternatives you've listed.
We're going to look at a video now, look at Labour's response. Like with many conservative moves many moves of this government, they're generally supportive. They seem to be supportive of the ban on having Huawei equipment in the UK, but there was a sort of critical edge, I suppose, constructive opposition, you might call it. Let's take a look at Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy speaking to the BBC Breakfast Show this morning.
Key parts of the technology are now going to be run by the Chinese rather than by the United States. But the answer to that is not simply to hand over our national security to China or to the United States and face that choice. The answer to that is for Britain to have our own homegrown technology and to work with other democratic countries across the world to pool technology and resources and make sure that we have an alternative. That's what we've been pushing the government to do for months now, and still there is no clear strategy in relation to our engagement with China, no clear strategy about homegrown alternatives, no clear strategy about working with democratic allies across the world in order to give us that strategic independence that we need. And we simply can't go on like this. National security has been an afterthought over the last decade as we've chased growth and trade across the world. The government has to start taking it seriously now, and we're determined to hold them to account for the commitments that they've made, long overdue as they were today.
Dalia, I want to go to you for comment on that, because you've got, I mean, it seems like smart politics, doesn't it? It's the Labour front bench trying to say that they value national security higher than the Conservative Party do, because the Conservative Party are only motivated by growth. An interesting argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think that response from Nandy kind of very much reveals how this politics of nationalism, how the Labour Party has decided to privilege this politics of nationalism over the politics of class. So if you were, and, piggybacking off what James was saying before, this isn't about, do we want this data or do we want these kind of new technologies that, particularly technologies like 5G, which are going to become, the backbone of the digital economy moving forward. The answer isn't, do we want to be in the control of this large corporation or this large corporation, or the US state or the Chinese state or the British state, which, Lisa Nandy is going for that, want the homegrown British companies or British state to own this technology. But rather it should be, should it be the workers, and should it be, communal ownership and public ownership, as opposed to the ownership by sort of corporation states, or states that both act like corporations and corporations that sort of act like states. So I think it's really disappointing to see that kind of lack of imagination, and it really does show to me that trying to kind of go for this sort of Little England nationalist framing over a class politics framing by the Labour Party, as it will, whether or not it will play out well with people, I have no idea. But as someone who is more interested in working class struggle than in, this technological Cold War that's developing, it's disappointing to see. But I think that, James is completely right here, which is that this is not really about data security. It's not really about even necessarily national security. It's about ownership of the world coming soon, ownership of a data-driven world in which data and information is a key axis of power. US hegemony has relied on, economic power. It's relied on military power. It's relied on soft power as well, that kind of political, diplomatic power, which is bolstered by this idea of America being the leader of the free world, etc., and also technological power. And China has caught up with America by some measures, and even exceeded by some measures the economic basis of US hegemony. It is also catching up technologically with its sort of ability to harness a lot of these newer technologies. But what we're seeing is, and we're also seeing at the same time, a fall of America's soft power because of not only, sort of Trumpism and the way that, part of Trumpism is to sort of abandon diplomacy in all of its sort of guises, but also in the handling of the pandemic. The pandemic is a really key context for this, I think, because the sort of poor handling of the pandemic by the US, by Britain, by the UK, and by Europe in general, in comparison to the handling of the pandemic by China, by Korea, etc., has also further accelerated that kind of decline of soft power the US has relied on for a very long time, and the kind of fact that China is coming forward as a more competent, a more sort of organized force. So I think that really what we're seeing here is a contestation around a multipolar world that is emerging. And as James said as well, I don't think that we should settle for this idea of, China versus the US. They're both just sort of different versions of hideous capitalism. But it's a shame that Labour has failed to interject in that and talk about class rather than sort of this sort of nationalist Cold War rhetoric that is emerging.
I mean, I suppose to be fair to Lisa Nandy in that video, she did say, it was a kind of like a neither America nor China line. She was saying,
let's neither Petersburg or Washington, neither Moscow or Washington line. But again, like this would have been a really good time to talk about class and public ownership and worker ownership. But we're just not going that far. But yeah, I think it's really important to understand that this isn't about data security or anything like that. All this data is always going to, it's owned by the few and not the many. The data of the many is owned by the few. It's always going to be at risk of being exploited and, manipulated. The question here is about, this, how data is emerging is a really important part of the new world that is being built, and how China is ahead of the US and ahead of a lot of Europe in that space.
I mean, what I'd love Labour to be going on is like the 1970s, 1980s Sweden line of neutrality, making a sort of third block other than the two emerging superpowers. Final story before we go to that, please do go to NavarroMedia.com/support if you like what we do and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you do already, thank you so much. You are what makes this possible. Andrew Neil, the BBC's most feared political interviewer, has this weekend taken to Twitter complaining that Owen Jones, a friend of the show, has been trying to cancel him. However, ultimately, it was not a left-wing journalist, but BBC budget cuts that would put an end to his show at the BBC. The Andrew Neil Show, which pitched the presenter against major politicians every Wednesday evening, has been off air since the start of the coronavirus crisis. But the BBC's announcement today means it will not be returning. Neil had previously told the Radio Times he feared he would be made surplus to requirements. He's apparently been talking to other broadcasters. Obviously, he used to work for Rupert Murdoch at the Sunday Times. Could he be going back there to Times Radio? At this point in time, we do not know. But the biggest story, other than Andrew Neil, though we will talk about that in a moment, is the numbers behind the scenes. So the cuts which have taken out Andrew Neil's show have also taken out 520 jobs at the BBC. That's from a workforce of around 6,000. That includes 450 job cuts that were announced as part of an £80 million savings drive in January and then put on hold because of coronavirus, and includes another 70 extra jobs going from the newsroom. This is also in the context of the government really doing one on the BBC. So you might have seen sort of all the Tory politicians trying to get you outraged at the fact that the BBC have cut free TV licenses for the over 75s. Everyone will have to pay for it now, whatever your age. What they don't normally mention is that the BBC have sort of been pushed into this position because the government cut their own subsidy. It used to be the government that subsidised directly the free licenses for over 75s. They took that away and then imposed strict budget cuts. So the BBC have had to make, a pretty difficult decision. I'm going to go straight back to you, Dalia. What do you make of all of this? Andrew Neil is, famously, as we've mentioned on this show, a presenter who is far more right-wing than you would ever get away with being left-wing. As a mainstream BBC host. He's chairman of The Spectator, which prints, some of the worst bile on Britain's news stands. But he also is pretty good at holding politicians to account of whatever stripe. What's your take?
Yeah, so there are two issues here, I think. There is the issue of the cuts to the BBC and what kind of impact that is happening on, our sort of media landscape as a whole. So I think it's sort of sad that this is being reduced to a story that's just about Andrew Neil. I would like to see sort of the breakdown of who are the people that have been axed, particularly kind of like the staff members that sort of make, the producers, etc. What is the breakdown of the other people behind those numbers, so that we're not just focusing on Andrew Neil. I also think that generally, as we see particularly big media organizations, not just broadcast, but also newspaper, having to really trim all of the sort of fat right to the bone of their organizations, we see much less work, in terms of sort of more critical and investigative analysis being done. Recently, the Victoria Derbyshire show, which I think, was kind of quite a good example of what a public broadcaster should do, sort of like really thoughtful, interesting, investigative pieces into issues that are often marginalized by other parts of the media, was also axed recently. What I think, Andrew, so I think there's that issue of, what is the impact of these BBC cuts and the particular relationship historically between the Tories and the BBC, and how it has both been a very friendly relationship, but also to an extent a relationship where the Tories have constantly tried to sort of undermine the BBC. But I also think that what is happening here, because before this was announced, what we saw was a lot of, Andrew Neil really getting stuck into this kind of recent iteration of cancel culture debate, where, he sort of, as he really went after Owen Jones, blaming him for trying to cancel Andrew Neil just because he was sort of softly critiquing on Twitter, like Andrew Neil's politics. And as you said, the fact that Andrew Neil is able to get away with being far more right-wing than anyone else is able to get away with being left-wing, and that apparently amounts to being cancelled. And I think that what we're seeing is a lot of these particularly very right-wing pundits, but not just right-wing pundits, also people that are kind of not feeling part of the tide when it comes to social justice issues, failing to actually argue on the actual points at hand. So whether that is trans rights, or whether it's anti-racism or things like that, failing to actually talk about the actual issue that they want to talk about and the actual issue that they want to push back on. And so instead framing it, protecting themselves and their jobs by framing their position as an issue of free speech and cancel culture and the Twitter mob. Right? So we don't talk about cancel culture and free speech when it comes to talking about the people, the groups, the opinions that are systematically stopped from entering into, the media or academy or research landscape to begin with. We only talk about it from the other way, people who have always felt entitled to have a platform in these various institutions and spaces, who are suddenly feeling not necessarily that platform's being denied, but it's just being contested. And so we're kind of going into that defense mode. And so what my worry is, and I think there is really a conversation that needs to be had about how we conduct ourselves in these discussions, and how we talk about sort of political education and moving through contradictions and disagreements. That's not the discussion that's being had in this cancel culture sort of war. What's happening here is people who have always felt entitled to having particular positions in influential institutions, having their position contested and feeling defensive about it, and sort of positioning themselves as, you have to hire me in the BBC or in the university, because if you don't, I'm going to say that this is because you're afraid of the Twitter mob and you don't want to be seen as being cowed by a Twitter mob. So let's actually talk about what we really want to talk about, which is, the gains being made by the anti-racist movement, by trans rights, by all of these issues. Let's talk about those issues rather than sort of this red herring of cancelling and no platforming, which actually is a separate conversation that needs to be had, but not when it comes to talking about the eternal right of Andrew Neil to, be the BBC's flagship TV presenter. That's not a God-given right to anyone.
I mean, I think something we also should be pushing is, funding of journalism is a free speech issue. If people aren't 100%. Paid to investigate things, then things aren't going to get found out, and all we're going to have is commentary.
And the decline of investigative reporting is a perfect way in which the kind of austerity narratives of, cutting back and all of that, and, having this whole thing of, something is only valuable if it has lots of clicks and ad revenue generated, in comparison to how much work is needed. So you pay much less for a shocking comment piece by Katie Hopkins, and you get a lot more ad revenue than you do for like the payment of a forensic investigation of like Serco's connections to like the detention and border regime in the UK, which might not, considering how expensive research like that is, the ad revenue is not as proportionately high as a think piece by Katie Hopkins. So it's a perfect marriage of that austerity politics with the desire to really clamp down on critical journalism. So that is really the conversation that I want to be having about these cuts at the BBC, rather than whether or not Andrew Neil's, should for eternity be hosting, his daily politics show or whatever show it is that he hosts. I'm not sure. One of the Politics Live, Daily Politics, I don't know, they've all merged into one in my brain.
I'm going to go to James, because one of my favourite takes on the BBC was actually from your old boss, John McDonnell. When he came on the show, we were sort of asking about, I suppose the left's love-hate relationship with the BBC, and he was saying, yeah, of course we should be critical of their output, but one of the big problems with the BBC is that they're underfunded, because the more they are, or the more they have to cut original journalism, the more they have to rely on Britain's corporate-owned press. And so he's saying what you should, if you want an independent BBC, you have to have a well-funded BBC, which completely goes against the likes of Marina Hyde or someone from she's from The Guardian, who are also, we'll mention their cuts in a moment, actually, who sort of tries to castigate the left as saying they hate the BBC so much they want to privatize it. No one on the left argues that, really. Maybe a couple of people on Twitter. But yeah, John McDonnell's line, you've got to fund it properly to get proper investigative journalism. And I mean, what do you see as the significance of this? Will the BBC survive the next 5 years under this Conservative government in its current form?
No, will the BBC survive? Well, yes, because it's actually useful for any government to have the BBC around, and it has a particular relationship with the Conservative Party, because let's be blunt, the Conservative Party are in government most of the time, so that develops there. But obviously I'm going to agree, well, not necessarily agree with John, but I do agree with him on this, which is that you're not going to get, and it's exactly the point Dalia said, and I basically agree with everything she said as well, which is that you're not going to get the quality journalism, you're not going to get the in-depth investigative stuff without the BBC being funded. The people losing their jobs, I would guess there is some, there are bits of Twitter and bits of the left that get very het up about the BBC and serves them right and this sort of thing. To be honest with you, the people who have been making editorial decisions and basically political decisions at the BBC, they're not going to be the ones losing their jobs. That's not going to be happening. This is going to be like ordinary workers at the BBC who are going to be facing the chop here. So of course you support them. But also there's this question of moving to a better funding model. There are, Tom Mills and other people have done good work about what that might look like, and reinforcing the public service broadcasting part of what it is the BBC should be doing. Breaking up, Tom Mills's suggestion is breaking up the BBC board and regionalising the BBC much more, putting it much more closely in touch with different sort of local and regional communities, if you like, throughout the rest of the country, as a way of removing that kind of institutionalised, sort of very Westminster-centric power at the top up there. And if you want a sort of embodiment of that institutionalised power, Andrew Neil is part of it. We all know Andrew Neil has many, many other strings to his bow, as they say, not least of which is being chair of the board of The Spectator. It doesn't really hurt him that much if he's not the person doing the interviews. He's also, I look, personally, I think he's good at a certain set of things with politicians. It would be nice to have some different kind of conversations with politicians, more developed conversations, ones where we can expand a bit. I think Stephen Sacker at Hard Talk does actually quite a good job with this sort of thing. Still quite a confrontational interview, but it's a bit more expansive. You can talk a bit more about what you think, rather than this hammering away at very, very specific points of detail that has been carefully picked by Andrew Neil's researchers out of the great big mass of things he could have picked, and you just hammer at that. It's a very particular style. It doesn't necessarily illuminate very much, and there would be better ways to do this. And perhaps we could look at the entire pattern of how the BBC and how our mainstream journalists and mainstream media conducts political interviews now would be something to look at.
I'm going to go to you, Dalia, for final comment, and it's going to be on the Guardian cut. So it wasn't just bad news for journalists at the BBC. We can get up a tweet from Jim Waterson, who is the media editor at the Guardian. So he's probably one of the people who finds out this particular bit of news first. 70 jobs to go in editorial departments and 110 to go in commercial roles. Revenues had been flat until the pandemic hit, now going off financial targets by well over £25 million. Dalia, what's your take on this? I've seen sort of various interventions on Twitter by people saying, yes, I do read The Guardian. I want it to be around, but because they spent so long trying to destroy the Corbyn project, I can't really part my cash to help them continue. Also, they've been, one of the longest holdouts when it comes to putting up a paywall. What do you make of this announcement here? What should we make of it?
Yeah, we have a crisis when it comes to mainstream media that has dominated the airwaves and also print media for so long. I think it's a double crisis of, a crisis of faith and the fact that the circulation is simply going down of a lot of these newspapers. And that's not just because of the digitization. But I think it's also because, as we've seen in so many of the previous elections, for better or for worse, a lot of these massive sort of hegemonic outlets have really failed to predict what's going to, to understand where the public are at. So I think that kind of creating that big space, I think, between like the journalistic class and, everyday people, I think is partly to do with this, and the fact that a lot of people are, again, for better or worse, turning to, and especially better in our situation, turning towards alternative, more independent media. So I think that is part of it. But also I think that there is a kind of, again, as I said before, I do worry that, there is an issue when it comes to how the impact. I don't think that these cuts are going to make that situation better. What these cuts are going to do is it's going to not only, again, as we said, reduce the amount of critical journalism, but it's also going to, journalism is already an incredibly poorly representative group of people that make up journalists. Not only are they something like, I think, 94% white, but nearly 50% of UK journalists went to private school. They come from a different world, a completely different class to, that's compared to only 7% of the British population went to private school. And cuts and the reduction of well-paid jobs and the increase of, 0 hours contracts, insecure contracts, reliance on freelancers, reliance on poorly paid internships is only going to entrench that. It's only going to increase the number of people who go into journalism, who go into media, who come from those privileged backgrounds and have that safety net, that financial safety net to fall onto. So really, I think it's both a symptom of, the kind of deepening class divide between those who own and also sort of make the big editorial decisions at a lot of these organizations and with everyday working class people. But unfortunately, these cuts are most likely going to entrench that division. So I think that, The Guardian and other organizations like this should be very worried.
I said you'd get the final point, Dalia. It's actually going to go to Nishat, who gave us a £48.99 super chat.
Wow.
Thanks for providing a much needed source of information, especially with reference to COVID-19, where your analysis has been excellent. Thank you so much for your kind words and also your hard cash. It will definitely go in handy to keep Novara Media going. Thank you everyone who has given us a super chat tonight. If you want to support us directly, then please do go to novaramedia.com/support, and we'll be back on Friday at 8 p.m. So make sure to hit subscribe and not to miss that. Something's just fallen over in the background, but it waited until the end of the show at least. Dalia, Gebrial and James Meadway, you've both been brilliant. Thank you very much. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.